Hey everyone, get ready, because today we're diving deep into the evolution of Times Square. You guys sent in some absolutely amazing stuff this time, including excerpts from Money Jungle. It's a book all about Times Square's transformation.
Oh yeah, Money Jungle. That's a good one.
And we even got some vintage photos to bring it all to life. So we're going to uncover how Times Square went from, well, let's be honest, kind of rough around the edges, to the dazzling corporate spectacle we know today.
Yeah, it's pretty wild how much it's changed, right? But it wasn't like a simple before and after.
Oh, how so?
Well, the story of Times Square is more like this constant push and pull between different visions of what it should be.
Ah, tug of war.
Yeah, exactly. And that tension is baked right into its history. It really helps explain how this iconic place evolved.
Okay, so you mentioned Money Jungle by Benjamin Chesluk. What's the main point he makes about Times Square?
Well, Chesluk really digs deep into how Times Square was redeveloped. And get this, he talked to all sorts of people, like developers, city planners, and even people who were part of this job training program called Times Square Inc.
Times Square Inc. That's a cool name. What was that all about?
We'll definitely get into that later.
Yeah.
It's super interesting, especially in the context of how Times Square tried to change its image. But for now, what's important is that Chisluk uses these different perspectives to lay out the strategies used to reshape the area, but also the impact these changes had on the diverse communities who were already living there.
So it wasn't all just shiny new buildings and success stories.
Not exactly.
Gotcha. So it sounds like we're not covering the entire history of Times Square in this deep dive, right?
You got it. Chesluk focuses specifically on a pretty specific time frame, the late 1970s through the 1990s.
Oh, that's interesting. Why those decades?
Well, it was a really pivotal time for both New York City and the U.S. in general, like huge economic shifts, changing social values, a whole lot of uncertainty about what cities should even look like.
Okay, I can see why he chose that period. It sounds like a time of massive change, a real turning point.
Absolutely.
All right, so for everyone listening, in this deep dive, we're on a mission. We're going to uncover the forces that shaped Times Square during these really crucial decades. We're talking tactics used to reshape the area, who benefited from those changes, who maybe got left behind, and what it all tells us about, well, power, control, and how the whole idea of public space can be twisted and turned in a world that's changing so fast.
Right. And to really get that, we have to kind of like rewind a bit. Before all the redevelopment, what was Times Square?
Okay, take us back in time. What was it like before the flashing billboards and those chain restaurants everywhere?
All right, picture this. It's the late 19th century. Times Square is already buzzing. But it's this really vibrant mix. You've got fancy theaters right alongside tenements, even brothels and factories.
Wow, so even back then it was already a melting pot of sorts. High culture rubbing elbows with, well, the grittier side of life.
Totally.
Hmm.
But even then, there was this push for what we might call respectability.
Respectability.
Mm.
What does that even mean in the context of Times Square?
Well, think of it this way. Back then, respectability was all about drawing these really clear lines between social classes, and how land could be
Oh,
used.
so keeping things separate and orderly.
Right. Developers and city planners wanted to give Times Square a more polished image, more refined, more controlled. But of course, that vision kind of clashed with the reality of, this incredibly diverse population that was always pushing boundaries and kind of making its own rules.
I can see the tension already brewing there.
Yeah, and it only gets more intense from here.
Right, so even in those early days, Times Square was a place of stark contrasts. You've got high culture next to everyday struggles, ambition mixed with the realities of, well, just trying to survive. But then, as we know, things really started to change. The spectacle took over,
It did, didn't it? Those massive electric signs, they became the main attraction.
and kind of a symbol of Times Square, at least for a while.
For sure. But it's important to remember that as we move into the early 20th century, Times Square becomes this central hub for advertising and consumerism.
Makes sense. Giant signs, giant products to sell.
Exactly. And those electric signs, they were actually pretty controversial when they first appeared. Some people saw them as this brash symbol of corporate power encroaching on public space.
It's funny, when you said vintage photographs earlier, my mind instantly went to those incredible images of like horse-drawn carriages sharing the streets with these massive, dazzling, modern electric signs. It's like a visual time warp.
Oh, totally. Those images capture it perfectly. That clash between the old world and this bold new advertising landscape, It's striking.
It makes you think about how Times Square has always been this place where different eras collide, where the past and future are always bumping into each other.
It is, isn't it? And it helps us connect this to the bigger picture, too. Remember, this is when mass production was taking off, and companies needed to create a demand for their new products.
They needed to reach the everyday person, not just the wealthy elite.
Yeah. And Times Square became this massive stage for that emerging consumer culture. Think of it like the rise of the department store, suddenly. Things that were once only for the rich became accessible to more people, and Times Square was where that new way of life was put on display.
It's amazing how much those early developments foreshadow what we see today. That same focus on spectacle, attracting a mass audience, and of course, consumerism at the heart of it all. But then things took a bit of a darker turn, didn't they? Times Square earned a pretty bad reputation for crime and seediness, something it's, well, kind of struggled to shake off ever since.
You're right, it did. As we get into the late 20th century, Times Square's image becomes almost synonymous with urban decay. Like if you've ever seen those gritty 70s movies like Midnight Cowboy or Taxi Driver, that's the vibe Times Square was giving off.
Yeah, a far cry from those dazzling early electric signs and the excitement of Broadway.
For sure. And that's where developers, the people with money and plans, they start using terms like blighted to describe Times Square.
Blighted, like it was a disease.
Yeah, and they used this language to justify their plans for a total makeover by framing the existing businesses and communities as, like, obstacles to progress that could push for a complete redevelopment.
So essentially wiping the slate clean, no matter who might get caught in the crossfire.
Well, it wasn't quite that simple, but it definitely raises some ethical questions. And then there's this concept of planned shrinkage, where the city focused heavily on developing Manhattan's corporate core, kind of neglecting other boroughs in the process.
Planned shrinkage. Never heard of that.
Yeah, it was this controversial policy, but it was happening. And remember, New York City was in a tough spot financially at this time. So the idea was to attract investment and revitalize the city by focusing on its most valuable asset, which was, of course, Manhattan.
So Times Square becomes this, like, a key battleground in this larger struggle over the city's future.
Exactly. And again, it raises a lot of those ethical dilemmas, like what happens to the people and communities that are pushed out in the name of progress? Who gets to decide what progress even looks like?
It makes you wonder if redevelopment was just a fancy way of saying gentrification, right? Did the communities who are already there have any say in these plans?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And we'll definitely dig into that more. But first, let's take a closer look at the specific tactics that were used to reshape Times Square. Because it wasn't just about bulldozing old buildings. It was about controlling the very fabric of the place, the space itself.
Controlling the space. Interesting. How so?
Well, think about it. Every architectural choice, even something as simple as a park bench or a streetlight, it can influence how people use a space. And the redevelopment of Times Square was full of examples where design was very intentionally used to discourage certain activities and encourage others.
Okay, now you've really got my attention. Give me some concrete examples. What kinds of design choices are we talking about here?
All right, let's take Bryant Park. It's that lovely park right next to the New York Public Library. They redesigned it to be much more open, with fewer hiding spots and better visibility, and they brought in more private businesses.
Trying to make it feel safer, I guess.
That was the idea. They wanted to make it feel more respectable, which again goes back to those anxieties about image and control. And of course, they wanted to deter crime, which was a huge concern at the time.
So they turned a public park into a place where everything's out in the open, almost like they were designing away the undesirable elements.
Yeah, there was definitely a push for that. And it wasn't just parks. Even the Port Authority bus terminal was redesigned with that same mindset. They installed tons of surveillance cameras, bright lighting everywhere. They even removed those little nooks and crannies where people might hang out or, try to sleep.
Wow. It sounds like they were trying to make it harder for certain people to even exist in these spaces.
Yeah.
But what about the heart of Times Square itself? What about 42nd Street? How did they approach that?
42nd Street. That's where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears.
The group in charge of redeveloping it, the 42nd Street Development Corporation, they used this mix of strategies. Some were about control, for sure, but others were about cultivating a specific image, like a sense of edge, all to attract new investors.
Edge. Like leather jackets and punk rock. How do you achieve that through design?
Well, this is where it gets really fascinating. They actually commissioned these art installations, including some pretty thought-provoking pieces by Jenny Holzer called Truisms. They even had haikus displayed on buildings.
Haikus. That's a new one.
I know, right? It was all about crafting this urban, gritty vibe while also signaling that change was coming, that this was a place on the rise.
So image is everything. Projecting a certain feel to attract the right crowd, the right investors, and create a new identity for Times Square. But what about the people who didn't fit into this new vision? The people who are already there living their lives?
That's a crucial question, and it's where the story of Times Square Inc. comes in. It really shines a light on the pressures to conform that came with this cleaned up, reimagined Times Square.
Okay, I'm even more curious about Times Square Inc. now. Let's imagine ourselves in the shoes of the people who were trying to navigate this rapidly changing environment.
Yeah.
What was Times Square Inc. all about?
Well, it was a job training program, but it was much more than that. It was designed to prepare people, often from marginalized communities, for corporate jobs. And there was a huge emphasis on presenting a respectable self, on fitting into this new Times Square.
Respectable. That word keeps coming up. It makes you wonder who gets to decide what's respectable and what isn't.
It's a good point. And Chesluk tells some really powerful stories about the people in the program. He talks about this one man who had run his own laundromat for years, but he was ashamed to put it on his resume because it didn't seem, respectable enough for the corporate world.
Wow. So even though he was a successful business owner, it wasn't the right kind of success for this new image of Times Square.
Exactly. And then there was another guy, a construction worker, who was super comfortable talking about tools and equipment, but really struggled to express those so-called soft skills that are so valued in the corporate world.
It sounds like they were being asked to downplay parts of themselves, to almost perform respectability, even if it didn't feel authentic.
You hit the nail on the head. And that pressure to conform, to erase parts of your identity, it had a real cost. It speaks to this hidden side of redevelopment, the anxiety of trying to find your place in a world that's changing all around you. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture when we talk about redevelopment, like all the plans and the powerful people making decisions. But reading Money Jungle, what really struck me was how Chesluk brought in those everyday voices, the people caught in the middle of these huge shifts.
That's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating, right? It's not just about abstract ideas or fancy buildings. It's about how real people deal with change, how they adapt, and how they try to hold on to what matters to them, what makes them feel like they belong, even as things are shifting all around them.
Yeah, exactly. And to really understand that struggle, I think we have to talk about broken windows policing. It had a huge impact on how New York was perceived and experienced really across the country, especially during this period.
Okay, broken windows policing. I've definitely heard the term before, and I know it's controversial,
Oh, absolutely.
but wasn't that more of a 90s thing, like Giuliani and zero tolerance? How does it tie back to the 70s and 80s, the period we're focusing on?
Well, broken windows is like the theory behind zero tolerance. It's this idea that if you crack down on minor offenses, things that might seem small, like graffiti or public urination, even just, looking like you don't belong, it can actually help prevent more serious crimes.
So the thinking is that if you fix the little problems, you stop the bigger ones from happening.
Right. It's all about creating an atmosphere of order and control. The idea is that if a neighborhood looks run down or chaotic, it's more likely to attract crime. But if you keep things tidy and enforce those small rules, it sends a message that crime won't be tolerated.
I mean, it kind of makes sense on the surface, but I can see how it could easily be misused, right?
Oh, totally. And it was. The biggest problem with broken windows is that it can lead to a lot of discrimination. Think about it. Who usually gets targeted for those so-called quality of life offenses? It's often people from marginalized communities, people who are already struggling.
And one of the sources you sent mentions something called the Citizens Police Academy, where residents were actually trained to spot those visible signs of a city out of control. It's like they were being taught to see disorder everywhere, even in the smallest things.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The training wasn't just about identifying crime. It was about framing the city through this very particular lens, one that emphasized potential threats and anxieties. It's like they were being taught to be constantly on alert, looking for anything that might disrupt this very narrow definition of order.
And Money Jungle mentions these really intense moments from community meetings. Residents were voicing their anxieties about crime and how their neighborhoods were changing, how they were being affected by all these grand plans.
Yeah, these meetings were really important. It's where you could see that clash between the official narrative of progress and how real people were actually experiencing these changes.
Can you give us some examples? What were some of the main concerns people were raising?
Well, the book talks about these meetings held by the Hell's Kitchen Neighborhood Association, and they were pretty heated. Residents were worried about all sorts of things: street harassment, drug dealing, the lack of affordable housing. They were afraid for their safety, but they were also losing those things that made their neighborhood unique, that sense of community, and they felt pushed out by new businesses, wealthier residents moving in, and this pressure to conform to this new image of what Times Square should be.
So they were being told that these changes were all about improving their quality of life, but they were experiencing a very different reality.
Right. That's the irony of it all. The police were talking about quality of life in terms of cracking down on anything that seemed messy or disruptive. But for residents, quality of life meant feeling safe in their own homes, having affordable places to live, and being able to maintain those social connections, those networks of support that are so crucial in a city like New York.
So these meetings became this space where people could challenge the official narrative, push back against these plans, and say, hey, our needs aren't being met here. This isn't progress for everyone.
Exactly. It was a way for them to make their voices heard and demand to be part of the conversation.
And one of the most interesting examples of this community pushback involved this plan to sell air rights above Broadway theaters. It sounds crazy, but it sparked a huge controversy.
Yeah, it was wild.
Hold on, selling air. You're going to have to explain this one because it sounds totally bizarre.
Okay, so imagine you own a building, right? You own the land it's on, and you own the building itself. But you also technically own the space above your building all the way up into the sky. You can't see it, can't touch it, but it still has value, especially in a city like New York, where space is at a premium. Air rights are basically the right to build in that empty space above an existing building. The city can sell those rights to developers, and then those developers can build taller structures or add extra floors to their projects.
Okay, so they were trying to sell the air rights above those historic theaters,
Yeah,
and the money would go towards preserving them, right?
right.
But at the same time, it would allow for more development, taller buildings, more density.
Right. And on paper, it sounds like a win-win. Save the theaters and make room for new development. But community groups saw it very differently. They saw it as another way to gentrify the area and hand even more power to wealthy developers.
It's like that fight to save the armed forces recruiting station, right? Even though it wasn't this beautiful landmark or anything, it represented something important to veterans groups. It was a piece of history they didn't want to lose.
Exactly. It's about more than just aesthetics. It's about what these places represent: history, identity, a sense of belonging. When you change the built environment so drastically, you risk erasing those things, those intangible but deeply meaningful aspects of a community.
So how did these community groups fight back against this plan? What did they do to make their voices heard?
Well, they got pretty creative. They organized protests, held public forums to raise awareness, and they came up with some really powerful messaging. One group, called the Clinton Special District Coalition, they used these really memorable slogans like, "Don't let developers steamroll Clinton," and "Shadow, shadow, shadow, shame." It was a way to draw attention to how these new buildings would literally cast shadows over their neighborhood, blocking out the light.
It's amazing how they use humor and these striking visual tactics to get their message across. It wasn't just about dry policy debates. It was about connecting with people on an emotional level, make them see the human impact of these grand development schemes.
Yeah, and it wasn't easy. They were up against some powerful forces, people with a lot of money and influence. But their efforts show us that the story of Times Square isn't just about top-down control, it's also about resistance, about people pushing back and demanding a voice and shaping their own environment.
It sounds like we've only scratched the surface of this story. What else did these communities do to try to reclaim their neighborhoods, to push back against these powerful forces that were reshaping their lives?
Oh, there's so much more to explore. We'll dig into some of those inspiring stories and look at how the fight for Times Square's soul continued to play out. It's a powerful reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, everyday people can make a difference.
It's wild how much ground we've covered, you know? Like we've gone from those early days when Times Square was this mix of high culture and grit to the rise of those dazzling advertisements, and then that period of decline where it was seen as like this symbol of urban blight. It's been a journey through time.
It really has. And what strikes me is how relevant all those themes are today, even outside of Times Square.
Oh, totally. I mean, every city is wrestling with these questions of development and gentrification and what it means to create a space that's safe and vibrant and, well, equitable for everyone.
Yeah. Like, think about that phrase you used earlier, testing ground of limits. What did you mean by that?
That's a good question. I guess I was thinking about how Times Square has always been this place where the rules are kind of fluid, where people push boundaries and test the limits of what's acceptable in public space.
Right. And it goes back to that tension we talked about earlier between control and chaos, respectability and, well, the messier realities of urban life.
From the very beginning, Times Square was this place where different worlds collided, right? High and low culture, ambition and struggle, all crammed together in this really vibrant, kind of chaotic space.
Exactly. And those redevelopment efforts, they were all about trying to impose some kind of order on that chaos, to define what kinds of behavior, what kinds of businesses, even what kinds of people were welcome in this new, reimagined Times Square.
But as we've seen, it didn't always go according to plan, did it?
Not at all. People resisted, they found ways to subvert those limits, and they carved out their own spaces within this changing landscape. They reminded us that cities aren't just blank canvases for developers to work with. They're living, breathing ecosystems full of complexity and contradictions.
And that's what makes them so fascinating, right? I mean, I'm a little biased because I love cities, but there's this energy, this constant evolution, this feeling that anything is possible.
I agree. And Times Square is like this microcosm of that energy, that constant push and pull. It's never static, never fully under anyone's control. It's a constant negotiation, a reminder that the city is always being remade, reshaped by the people who live there.
So after spending all this time immersed in the history of Times Square, what are some of the biggest takeaways for you? Like, what do you hope people will think about after listening to this deep dive?
That's a good question. I think one of the most important things is to be critical, especially when it comes to development and how public space is used. We have to ask those tough questions. Who benefits from these projects? Whose voices are being silenced? What are the unintended consequences?
It's easy to get swept up in the spectacle, right? Like all those flashing lights and billboards, it's designed to grab your attention and make you feel like you're part of something exciting. But we can't forget that there are real human stories behind those transformations, costs, and benefits that aren't always shared equally.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to engage with multiple perspectives. If we want to truly understand the complexities of city life, we need to listen to residents, to activists, to developers, to business owners, to everyone who has a stake in how our cities evolve.
This deep dive has taken us on this incredible journey through the past, but it's also raised a ton of new questions about the future. Like, what's next for Times Square? How do we create cities that are both vibrant and inclusive, that celebrate their history while embracing the future?
Those are questions we all need to grapple with, and they're not just relevant to New York. These are challenges that any city facing growth and change has to address. And I think Times Square's story offers some valuable lessons, some reminders of what to watch out for, what to fight for, and the importance of making sure that everyone has a seat at the table when we're talking about the future of our cities.
So the next time you're in Times Square, amidst all the flashing lights and the crowds, take a moment to really look around. Think about the layers of history, the struggles and triumphs of the people who have shaped this iconic place. And ask yourself, what role do you want to play in shaping the future of our cities? What kind of city do you want to live in? Because ultimately, the story of Times Square and the story of every city is still being written. And we all have a part to play in making sure that it's a story that reflects our values, our hopes, and our dreams for a more just, equitable, and vibrant future.